Welcome, and thank you for participating in today's committee meeting. If attending in person, please do not connect to Zoom or teleconference while in the room. To prevent disruptions, please silence all devices. All participants on Zoom and on the phone, except for committee members and South Coast AQMD staff, will be placed on mute. You will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually. After each item, public comment will be taken. If you are participating in person at a location listed on the agenda and wish to comment, please raise your hand when comments are called for. If you are participating on Zoom and wish to comment, please click on the Raise Hand button. If you are participating by phone and wish to comment, please dial *9. If you are participating via Zoom or phone, when it is your turn, the host will unmute your line. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for all items on the agenda. Following the meeting agenda items, a general public comment period will provide the public an opportunity to speak on any items not on the agenda within the committee's authority. During the general public comment period, speakers may be limited to 3 minutes or less. The amount of time to comment may be shortened to ensure all speakers can be heard. A countdown timer may be displayed on the screen for each public comment. For questions or issues related to making public comment, please call the public advisor at 909-396-3247. In terms of decorum, in accordance with state and local public health department guidelines, people may choose to wear a mask based on personal preference while in South Coast AQMD facilities. Please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being removed from the meeting. Lastly, please be aware that this meeting is being recorded. By participating, you agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public by South Coast AQMD.
Thank you, Mark. I'll call the meeting to order at 12:09 p.m. Let's do roll call.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
We have Board Member Padilla Campos absent, Senator Delgado absent, Supervisor Hagman, Councilmember Solache absent, Elizabeth Alcantar, Manuel Arredondo absent, Angie Valderas,
Present.
Dr. Beeson, Susan Bilodeau, thank you, Paul Choi, Carrie Doi, Dr. Afif Hassan, Al Hassan, Mary Figueroa, Angela Garcia, Kareem Gongora, Ana Gonzalez, Dr. Joel Johnson, Humberto Lugo, David McNeil, Donald Smith, and Rafael Yanez. Thank you.
So we don't have a quorum. We don't have a quorum, right?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. I see Supervisor Hagman joined us.
Just
Welcome,
joined.
Supervisor. We'll go to we'll skip items on numbers 1 and 2. We don't have a quorum, so we'll do item number 3, the follow-up action items. And the follow-up action item was to for Mr. Arredondo for the address site with dust. Staff followed up with Mr. Arredondo, and he informed staff that the area was fenced off and sprayed down with the green chemical, so I guess no longer needed. Next item, let's see, discussion items, number 4. But before I do that, Supervisor, did you want to have any opening remarks?
Oh, you literally caught me with my hands full. No, thank you. This is my first meeting, so I'm going to be here to learn and see what we're doing, Derek.
Thank you very much, Supervisor. Go Navy. Let's see. Next item would be the presentation from ARB. We have a guest speaker from ARB. You want to introduce yourself and open up with your presentation.
Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Michael Benjamin and I'm Chief of the Air Quality Planning and Science Division at the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. I'm happy to be here to provide an overview of the development, implementation, and enforcement of CARB's transportation rules. Our regulations are helping transition California towards zero emissions and are critical to achieving our climate goals, cleaning the air across the state, and protecting our most vulnerable communities from exposure to toxic air pollutants. Equity and environmental justice are at the forefront at CARB as we push the transportation sector towards zero emissions. California's most vulnerable populations, especially lower income households and communities of color, bear the burden of pollution and have the most to gain as our transportation sector and industries move away from fossil fuels. Next slide, please. Across much of California, the key to improving air quality is reducing emissions of oxides of nitrogen, or NOx, a precursor to both ozone and fine particulate pollution. These two charts show the contribution of South Coast mobile source NOx emissions today in 2023 on the left-hand side and in 2037 on the right-hand side, reflecting the benefits of adopted CARB and Air District programs. The different shades of blue in the charts represent the contribution of NOx from mobile sources in the South Coast Air Basin, while green represents the contribution from stationary sources, and yellow the contribution from area-wide sources. Both now and in 2037, mobile sources will account for about 80% of total NOx emissions in the South Coast. By the relative size of the two pie charts, you can see that NOx emissions are projected to decrease significantly between 2023 and 2037. And a large part of that decrease is due to the implementation of CARB mobile source regulations. For instance, NOx emissions from heavy-duty vehicles in South Coast is projected to decrease from 21% to 12% of total NOx emissions in the basin due to implementation of CARB's recently adopted Advanced Clean Trucks and Advanced Clean Fleets rules. While we are seeing reductions in on-road mobile source emissions, CARB has also adopted rules for off-road mobile sources, such as locomotives and transport refrigeration units, or TRUs, which will provide significant additional emissions reductions. CARB is also pursuing new Tier 5 off-road emission standards, which will further reduce NOx emissions. Although CARB is aggressively pursuing a strategy to transition mobile sources under its control to zero emissions, the federal government is lagging in its regulation of categories like ships, aircraft, and rail, such that the relative contribution of all off-road sources to NOx in South Coast actually increases between 2023 and 2037. I will discuss more about CARB rules and federal government authority later in my presentation. Next slide, please. The South Coast has significant challenges in attaining the ozone standard, which drives both the district's and CARB's regulatory priorities and rulemaking schedule in the years ahead. CARB and the district have worked together very closely over the last few years to identify all of the measures and reductions needed to attain EPA's most recent ozone standard of 70 parts per billion, or ppb. CARB committed to a suite of measures and reductions from state sources in the 2022 SIP strategy, which was incorporated into the district's recently adopted 2022 AQMD. This bar chart shows the emission reductions needed to attain the ozone standard in South Coast by 2037. The bar on the left-hand side of the chart reflects the baseline emission inventory without the benefit of regulations, new regulations proposed by CARB in the district. The different colored portions of the bar correspond to different source categories, similar to those that were shown on the previous pie chart. The dashed black line at 60 tons per day represents the emissions level needed to attain the 70 ppb ozone standard. The middle bar reflects the reductions expected from CARB and district measures. These are significant, but still not enough to meet the needed overall reductions. The bar on the right shows that only with federal action to control sources under their control can we reach the 60 tons per day NOx carrying capacity level needed to meet the 70 ppb 8-hour ozone standard in the South Coast. Next slide, please. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the 2022 SIP strategy identified the emissions reductions from state and federal sources necessary to attain the ozone standard by 2037. In the 2022 SIP strategy, CARB committed to an unprecedented variety of new measures to reduce emissions from sources under our authority using all mechanisms available. The measures in the 2022 state SIP strategy were guided by concepts developed in the 2020 mobile source strategy. The 2020 mobile source strategy is an integrated planning document that identifies concepts to transition to cleaner mobile source technologies in the time frame needed to achieve all of California's targets: attainment of air quality standards, toxic risk reduction, and carbon neutrality. CARB is currently kicking off development of the next iteration of our strategy roadmap, the 2025 mobile source strategy, and additional information will be coming out this fall, including opportunities for community engagement and input. Both the mobile source strategy and SIP strategy serve as CARB's roadmaps for specific actions needed to achieve our air quality goals over the next 20 years. Next slide, please. In the 2022 SIP strategy, CARB committed to a comprehensive list of mobile source measures, including a number of critical efforts that will reduce emissions in our most vulnerable communities. A couple of key mobile source measures that will benefit priority communities include the recently adopted in-use locomotive and advanced clean fleets regulations that will reduce NOx as well as harmful particulate matter. CARB committed to pursue amendments to the cargo handling equipment regulation and develop a Tier 5 off-road vehicles and equipment regulation within the next few years. CARB also committed to a second rule further reducing emissions from transportation refrigeration units with a target date of 2026 for CARB action. Finally, CARB committed to reducing emissions from ocean-going vessels, or OGVs, with board action expected in the 2027 timeframe. These key mobile source measures will significantly reduce NOx and particulate emissions in the South Coast, thereby benefiting priority communities living near roads, ports, warehouses, and industrial facilities. CARB is and will continue pursuing regulations to protect these communities, as well as improve regional air quality in the South Coast. Next slide, please. Now that you have an idea of the timing of these actions, I will quickly go over the CARB regulatory process. The CARB regulatory process includes three critical elements: development, implementation, and enforcement. And community engagement and input is critical to each of these steps. CARB is working to improve our outreach and engagement efforts across the agency. For regulations, this means that throughout the regulatory process, CARB is taking the initiative to engage with interested parties, including communities, early and often. Maintaining engagement with communities during all steps of the regulatory process ensures communities are heard, questions can be addressed, and CARB staff can make meaningful changes and adjustments to programs to target benefits in priority communities and ensure emissions from mobile sources are reduced in the most equitable way possible. Next slide, please. This slide provides some more specifics on what this means for each of the regulatory steps. In developing regulations, CARB is hosting public workshops and having meetings with community members and community-based organizations and other interested parties to identify issues and create the most comprehensive solutions possible. When implementing regulations, CARB is prioritizing rule benefits like reduced emissions in priority communities so that exposure in these neighborhoods is minimized as soon as possible. When enforcing regulations, CARB is monitoring regulated vehicles and equipment operating in communities and assessing rule compliance and where to target enforcement resources, which can also help inform potential rule amendments. I'm now going to touch on a few specific CARB mobile source regulations that will benefit South Coast communities. Next slide, please. The Advanced Clean Fleets regulation adopted earlier this year is one of the key measures that will benefit priority communities by reducing emissions from drayage trucks operating at the ports and heavy-duty trucks traveling on freight corridors, roadways, and around logistics centers like warehouses. This regulation requires fleet owners to meet zero-emission targets for an increasing percent of their fleet and works in conjunction with the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation adopted in 2021, which helps ensure that zero-emission trucks are brought to market. It represents the most far-reaching regulation for heavy-duty truck fleets in the US by requiring the phase-out of dirty combustion vehicles to zero emissions. Next slide, please. The in-use locomotive regulation was also adopted earlier this year and focuses on reducing emissions associated with rail yards, another significant source impacting priority communities in the South Coast. The locomotive regulation aims to reduce the use of the oldest and highest polluting locomotives in California by implementing a spending account, in-use operational requirements, idling limits, registration, reporting, and record-keeping requirements. This regulation accelerates the adoption of advanced, cleaner technologies, including zero-emission technologies for locomotive operations. The monumental in-use locomotive regulation is one example of how CARB is pursuing all mechanisms under our authority to reduce emissions, even from primarily federally regulated sources, due to the lack of action at the federal level. Next slide, please. Additional inaction at the federal level has resulted in CARB also taking action to reduce emissions from ships. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach are the largest ports in the US, and ships represent a very significant emission source for communities living near or around ports. CARB currently has two primary regulations in place to reduce emissions from ships: the Clean Fuel and the at-berth regulations. The Clean Fuel regulation has been in place since 2008 and requires the use of cleaner burning fuels when ships are within 24 miles of the California coast. The at-berth regulation was adopted in 2007 and recently amended in 2020, and requires ships to plug into shore power when docked at California ports. CARB published an interim evaluation report as part of the at-berth regulation in December 2022, in which staff recommended prioritizing the exploration of additional measures to achieve further reductions from ships. CARB is exploring all options and is committed to reducing emissions from ships to help protect Southern California communities. Initial efforts are underway in support of additional rulemaking to address ship emissions, with a formal kickoff for rule development in the early 2024 timeframe. Staff expects these future regulatory efforts will provide emissions reductions from anchoring and maneuvering, as well as in transit, and would apply to all ship types, including bulk and general cargo ships. Addressing in-transit emissions will accelerate California's efforts and leverage other international efforts to mitigate the impact of shipping pollution. Since ships are regulated primarily through the International Maritime Organization, advocacy and coordination with federal and international oversight and regulatory organizations will also be needed to achieve additional emissions reductions beyond what CARB is doing. Next slide, please. Enforcement is an essential element of the regulatory process that ensures regulatory compliance, especially for communities that are disproportionately impacted. These efforts include responding to concerns from the public when they are being impacted by a violation, providing compliance assistance to regulated entities, conducting inspections and investigations to gather additional information, and taking enforcement action when necessary to resolve non-compliance as quickly as possible. CARB recognizes the need for increased enforcement efforts in priority communities. Therefore, at least 50% of all mobile source inspections occur in priority communities. The Enforcement Division's Environmental Justice Team focuses on understanding and addressing community concerns. Staff liaisons are assigned to communities across the state, and CARB actively supports and participates in Cali PA environmental justice enforcement initiatives through focused enforcement of all relevant CARB programs in selected communities. Although CARB's enforcement program works closely with the public, including priority communities, to identify, verify, and resolve air quality complaints, CARB maintains an active complaints program to support the public when impacted by an air quality concern. Next slide, please. The measures and incentives that we develop are targeted and intentional, with reductions occurring in many of California's priority communities and additional efforts to target priority populations, such as incentives for low-income consumers for zero-emission technologies. CARB is committed to ensuring that our efforts to transition to zero include benefits for all Californians. Last year, CARB approved the 2022-2023 funding plan for clean transportation incentives which represents the largest incentive-based investment to date with $2.6 billion allocated. The plan represents the largest investment in equity by prioritizing incentives towards low-income, disadvantaged communities and small fleets through programs such as Clean Cars for All, HVIP, financing assistance, and CVRP. In addition to these programs and others that are comprehensively addressed in the annual funding plan, CARB has other incentive programs that come from separate funding sources, including Community Air Protection Program incentives and the Carl Moyer Program, which also provides critical benefits and emission reductions in priority communities. Next slide, please. While CARB and the district are working to identify all actions within our jurisdictions to reduce emissions from primarily federally regulated sources, I want to highlight that we cannot achieve the air quality standards in South Coast without action at the federal level. This chart shows statewide mobile source NOx emissions from 2000 to 2040, with the blue line representing the emissions from California regulated mobile sources such as cars and trucks, and the orange line representing emissions from primarily federally regulated sources such as interstate trucks, planes, trains, and ships. NOx emissions from primarily federally regulated sources surpassed those from California regulated sources in 2020, and without more stringent federal controls, emissions from federally regulated sources will be double those of California regulated sources by 2031. Given the contribution from these federally regulated sources, federal action is critical to attain the federally mandated air quality standards and protect the public health of priority communities in South Coast and throughout California. Next slide, please. I would like to close with a few final thoughts. Equity and environmental justice continue to be a priority at CARB, and we will continue to try to increase and improve our outreach and engagement across all CARB programs. As I have highlighted, CARB is pursuing the most far-reaching transportation rules to date, which are already reducing emissions and will continue to benefit priority communities. But more needs to be done, especially at the federal level. CARB looks forward to our continued collaboration with community members in the South Coast and across the state. Next slide, please. Thank you, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Michael, thank you very much for that very informative presentation. I'd like to open up to questions. I'll start off with Supervisor Hagman. Supervisor, do you have any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Derek. And I do. I really appreciate the presentation. I'm a fairly new member this year on the board, but I've been involved with government for 25 years now. So trying to see all these pieces together, and I come from a very pragmatic standpoint. And one of the frustrations I finally came to self-realize a couple months ago, no matter what we do here, we're not going to get to these goals that are set. So I started asking that, and that was very clear in your presentation. Thinking about the federal stuff changing, we will never reach our standards that we're being held to by the federal government. So I want to try to figure out why. I know that we're the #1 place in the world, as far as I know, for EV vehicles and all that technology. So what makes it special about South Coast that's different than other population centers throughout the country? And the only thing I can conclude is our geography, density and geography. So we have these nice mountains around us that are not letting the flow as much as other places in the United States that have equal density, on the East Coast and things like that. So I'd love to get your perspective on that as a question. And it's, if we can't change it, what's going to happen? And then sitting on that, saying that, knowing my friends in Congress and knowing I served a lot of them back in the state legislature, to ask them to change the rest of the country standard because one section of California is not meeting it. It's a lot of cost to bear on industry and everything else because of that. Is that a practical solution? I know we're going there with electric vehicles and stuff, but the same standards that we put here in South Coast, they're very costly standards to build business and industry. It does have effects on where they locate, where they move to, and those type of things. If I'm a legislator over a different state, it's like, there's no way this is going to happen. So are we being fair to ourselves to say, really, we're going to beat the drum, the federal government, you got to change your standards, when there's no reason for them to change it for the rest of the 95% of the country? So I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And then I always want to know the cause and effect of things that we do as policymakers. Are we tracking industry? Are we tracking businesses? Are we tracking migration of our residents as we put these standards on our companies? Are we really having that net benefit that we're looking for? If, I know we just passed a rule last couple of weeks ago about commercial ovens. I already had one of the companies come to me and say, they're just going to move up to my high desert. Different air quality sector over there. Don't have the same regulations. Now I'm thinking now they're going to be trucking in all those baked goods from the high desert down here. I'm adding more traffic, more truck traffic, and more miles on the ground. Are we having that bigger view approach through CARB or through some other regulatory body? Yeah, we're going down. Technology brought us down, which is great, but we can't obtain what we're forced to obtain by any practical means at this point. And at what cost are we doing it to the left that we do have preview over? It's not a simple question, not a simple answer, but those are the things wrapped in my mind.
Okay, I heard three questions, I think, and I'll try to unpack them and walk through them. So in the first question, there's no doubt that Southern California and South Coast in particular has the worst air quality in the country. And there are a variety of reasons for that. And you touched on them, which is this is one of the largest metropolises in the country. It's the host of the largest port complex in the country. It has a major airport, has extensive industry. So there are lots of sources of pollution in the South Coast. Two other factors that really contribute to why we are actually experiencing air pollution or bad air quality, and you touched on those as well. One is the mountains that surround the basin. They trap air pollution. Unlike other parts of the country, let's say in the Midwest, where you don't have those sorts of challenges. And then the third element is the climate and the meteorology. Unlike other parts of the country where it may rain throughout the year periodically and wash out the atmosphere, in Southern California, we have a lot of sunlight. We don't have rain in the summertime. And so that allows pollutants to be trapped by the mountains. You get a lot of photochemistry in the summertime, and that leads to really high ozone levels in South Coast. So it's really a convergence of those three factors is why we are unique. And that is honestly a challenge that comes into play on perhaps your third question, which is getting the attention of the federal government to actually take action when they don't see these types of issues in other parts of the country. And so they see California as kind of a unique place, a unique beast, so to speak. On the second question, yeah.
Respond to that. So I completely 100% agree with you. And I appreciate the honesty and assessment. Just knowing how legislatures work, if 5% of, or in our case, maybe 8% of the population needs something, the best case I could see us doing is advocating for more resources to accelerate some of our programs we have. But I can't believe 9 out of 10 legislators are going to vote to impact rules and regulations upon their businesses, their residents, their things domestically to make sure that we have a shot at getting this. And if so, should we be advocating for something else besides the rule changes?
You mean national legislators? Yeah, so that is a big challenge. And Senator Padilla and other California representatives have been lobbying hard for action by US EPA, as well as for additional resources, for example, incentives to help turn over equipment. Your second question was?
No, I'm just saying, should we be advocating for anything else besides resources? If I'm FAA, because I have a little airport in my neck of the woods too, to sit there and try and make a multinational agreement to change the standards of engines for anybody flying into the United States is near to impossible to do. You know, I don't see that being practical, but yet we're saying that's how we're going to get to where we need to get. So again, from the practical standpoint, you know, to add that cost when they go lobbying all this other senators and congress members from different states saying, we don't have a problem, why you're making me put 30% more into my cost. Is that really, do we really expect outcomes from that? Same thing with the ships
Right.
when multinational shipping and stuff.
Well, and this is the challenge that we have in California, because what we are doing is just like other non-attainment areas in the country, and there are other areas, we are legally required to attain the national federal air quality standards. And if we don't, there are implications, loss of federal highway funds, 2-to-1 sanctions on stationary sources. And so we have no choice but to take actions, and whatever actions we can to get the necessary emission reductions. In terms of making the case to national legislators, there are things, and we identified some of these potential strategies in our mobile source strategy and in our 2022 state SIP strategy. For example, with federal sources like ships and aircraft, is prioritizing visits by the cleanest of those vehicles. In other words, when you look at the ship fleet, the emissions across the ship fleet varies pretty widely. Some ships are quite dirty, some are much cleaner. Same thing with aircraft. When we look at the aircraft that are flying into LAX, there's a big difference in how clean they are. And the federal government has the ability, if they wanted to, I'm not saying none of this is easy. None of this is easy, but they have the ability to help establish clean visit requirements, which is only the cleanest vehicles would come to California. Same thing with rail. So it's not easy, but there are things that can be done beyond simply setting tighter emission standards. But the reality is that, and this is a huge challenge, it's not easy, is that in much of Southern California, we're going to have to move to zero emissions. And we're going to have to figure out how to do that through a combination of regulations and incentives.
So again, and then I thank you, Mr. Chair, for one follow up. The last question was, are we studying this? Are you studying this? Is the state studying this? I could see us moving operations, let's say from the ports of Long Beach and LA to Northern Cal or the Mexico, and training things up, or to different states like we have in other industries, or we have maybe more vehicle traffic because of that. So are we trying to look at this and say the cause and effect? Are we having the reductions the proper way versus exporting our economy, exporting our jobs, or making our residents drive further to their jobs they used to have local, and we have a net negative effect? I mean, how do we track that?
Well, it's not easy. And the reality is that everything is interconnected. And when we develop our regulations and our strategies, we do our very best to do economic analysis, actually economy-wide in California. So we'll look at, let's say with a truck regulation, and we'll say if we force trucks to turn over to zero emissions and there's going to be an added cost, what will that do to different size fleets, and what will be their ability to pay? Who can afford to pay to transition? Who cannot? Who might need incentives to help them make that transition? And then quite honestly, what will it mean in terms of consolidation of the industry? The reality is that what we've seen with some of the regulations we've adopted, and I think some of our truck rules, is that it did force some small businesses out of business. They just could not survive anymore. And it really, I think, in some ways pushed consolidation of the industry. And that's happening in other sectors as well because of the incremental cost, because of the additional burden. So I'm not saying by any means that when we're pursuing these strategies that it's pain-free, or that there aren't certain people who are going to suffer from it. But it's just an incredibly complex trade-off that we're trying to make in terms of how do we get the emission reductions, protect public health, and still try to maintain a vibrant vibrant economy in Southern California.
I appreciate it. Thank you for trying to keep that whole picture in mind as we go forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Supervisor. Dr. Beeson?
Yeah, we know that there are multiple sources of our ambient air pollution, and you alluded to one of those being our container ships. And we know that probably many use the cheap, dirty bunker fuel when they're out in the open ocean. And you alluded to the fact that we were asking them within to get a little more than 20 miles from shore that they change to cleaner fuels. How does that actually function in terms of verifying that? Does somebody actually go off over to the ship, and do they actually have a tank that has cleaner fuel, which is more expensive? And did they actually convert over? So what is the process of verifying that they did in fact switch over to cleaner fuels?
Great question. So we have a whole team in our enforcement division at CARB that's dedicated to enforcing our OGV regulations. And they actually go out to ships that are coming into the ports. They board the ships. They have the authority to board the ships, and they take fuel samples. And so they're able to verify what fuels are being used. And so fines have been levied against operators for not switching to cleaner fuels. We've also been doing studies, and we might have done one in conjunction actually with South Coast staff, using aircraft or drones to fly over these ships and measure their plumes to see what they're actually emitting at different distances from shore. So we're not inspecting every single ship that's coming in, but we're doing enough, we think, to be able to, let's say, instill fear, a little bit of fear, enough to make sure that the ship operators are complying.
Thank you, Dr. Beeson. Raphael?
Thanks, Derek. Thank you, Derek.
Okay.
So I had a few questions. And I guess, thinking about the supervisor's comments in terms of, how to address, those states and state representatives that are outside the state of California and in the Midwest, or, whether or not plagued by, surrounded mountains and the topography and all that other stuff, and then all the various ports. They have the benefit of having flat lands and all this wind going through the heartland and all that other stuff. And why should we vote for it? Well, look at what's going on now. You have a huge amount of a heat dome that's developed over the central part of the entire country. A lot of people, for years, just ignored climate change. And they're ignoring many of the issues that, ultimately come from the pollution and all the unregulated industries that, are in the various states. And, it's a problem. California is just, leading the way, because we have looking at Southern California specifically, we have a topography and we have nature, a beautiful ecosystem that feeds a good portion of the United States, with all of our farmlands and whatnot. So, it's important that, we look at not only just how much money it's going to cost a particular state or country, how drives the industry or anything else like that. You have to look at the big picture. And the big picture is, we have global warming, we have black carbon that's depositing on all the various glaciers. We have quickly melting glaciers that are ultimately, causing many of the, countries around the world to start running out of water. And so, and then, it's causing sea level rise. So you have all the perimeter, states that have, coastlines and whatnot. So there's like a plethora of things like you could argue about why is it that we need to invest in
you know, ultimately lowering the emissions from not only our mobile sources, but also our industry, and how much it's going to plague our future. So, you know, a lot of people have this now mentality and not think of the future, what's going on. This is what needs to happen, because you have to think, oh, it's not going to happen in my adult lifetime, because I'm 50 now, and I'm lucky if I got another, you know, all right, I'll say 40 years. But, you know, what about my kids? What about my grandkids that I haven't had yet and hope to have? What's the state of the world going to look like then? Especially, you know, I was just watching a documentary yesterday just on large ships. Larger and larger ships are being built every single year in and year out, and we're having to increase our port size. Like our ports alone, we're one of the few ports in California that can handle those huge, the very large super tankers that are just ginormous. You know, to see, and then you have to think about what's going on in the world today, right? So if we're arguing the point where, well, you know, we're gonna export all of our jobs, we're gonna export all of our you know, what keeps, you know, these ships going out to Mexico, or, you know, some other parts of the country, and having it all shipped in. Well, guess what's happening in Mexico? You know, it's, you know, if they decide to establish ports down there, think about the drug cartels that's going down there. I mean, how safe are you, you know, transporting just a regular, you know, delivery down there? And, you know, you kind of get the idea. You know, we have to be realistic about, you know, the types of jobs that will lose, industries that will, you know, ultimately lose out. And then, but you got to also think about the environment and the future, and then just the ability to live. Like, look, going back to the Midwest and the heat dome that's occurring there. We have hundreds of people dying and thousands of people that can't even pay their electric bill anymore because they can't sustain the 24-hour-a-day air conditioning system. And how much pollution is that causing? You know, and so the more and more we utilize electricity, and all that other stuff, and the power grid and all that other stuff, we have to look at like the big picture. And if politicians in the federal government that, you know, like your former colleagues or whatnot, if they're not thinking that way, then you got to wonder, like, what's their focus? Are they really looking after everybody's interest or their own personal interest? That's the bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. Yeah, when I heard you saying the electricity bill, it reminded me of my bill this month of almost $500 that I'm gladly going to pass on to my adult children that live here, that they can help pay for that too. So not everybody can do that, but I do at my house.
500 is cheap, Derek. I wish I had a 500-a-month bill.
Yeah, so let's go with, I don't see any other hands. Are there any other hands raised?
Maybe just one other comment. I heard on the news that the Panama Canal is drastically reducing the shipping because of the drought, and the lakes that feed the Panama Canal is not allowing them to have a deep draft, and so they are loading the ships with less material so they don't bottom out because the level of Panama is dropping. So, you know, the conditions that we are finding ourselves in the climate change is affecting shipping.
Yep.
That Panama Canal is a major source of shipping coming in, and they're reducing what's going through.
And less cargo on the ships means more ships having to ship that stuff over. So, all right. See no other hands. I'll go to public comment. I understand we have one public commenter with the area code of 424. Go ahead.
Hello. Am I being heard?
Yes, Harvey, go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Harvey Etter. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Benjamin. We did a study on equity. You talked about equity in the 617 communities. We think it was the first one done in the state. It was done with the PUC, with the first Black commissioner, Commissioner Grimes, as part of Y42, $180 million for hot water systems. It was 10% earmarked for low income for the first time. So we were consultant on that and it was called the Low Income Solar Equity Program. Oh, sorry, I got street noise coming here. Okay. We heard recently that you're trying, you've got a program which is like $450,000 per heavy duty 8 truck, and that is down to like 400 in incentives. So there's only a balance of 50 grand there. Okay, that's encouraging. And we put in a program, $63 million, to start worker-owned co-ops and to be vertically and horizontally integrated for manufacturing, installation, from PVs and other technologies, and to recycling, the closed cycle. But one thing here that concerns, and we've brought this up before, is you say zero emission. Okay, on the vehicle, that's fine. But what happens in the grid, in the power system, isn't. And as long as that system is not 100% solar renewables, it cannot be legal climb, and they should not be able to get the tax credits in full proportion to that, only in proportion that is, and that should be the policy of the state and of these regulatory agencies, as the PUC and CEC as well. And this is very important, okay? And also on equity, when they have the 40% now and the justice 40%, they're talking about reducing emissions so poor people aren't exposed to get to the same mortality and morbidity rates or higher rates, okay, versus the wealthier areas. Fine. But we want to extend that, and this is what we brought up 40 years ago at the PUC with our study, which hasn't been evaluated by the state at all, unfortunately, is that we ought to at least double that, and then we're going to be talking equity, ownership, control, decision-making, okay, public power, etc. And that this and then there was a book out 50 years ago how to turn 60,000 workers into owners, employee stock ownership programs, etc. The democracy at work, etc. These programs, and the Amberdragon Corporation in Spain, the 5th largest corporation in Spain, started for World War II with the church. They were sitting around, nothing to do. They started worker co-ops. Now they've got their own university researchers, the 5th largest corporate entity in the country, and Microsoft and
You muted, Derek.
Sorry about that. Got the next public commenter. Looks like it's Moses Huerta.
Thank you, Mr. Doctor. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go right ahead.
Thank you. My name is Moses Huerta. I'm currently a resident here in the city of Paramount, but I'm also a technical lead on EPA Environmental Justice Air Monitoring Project here in the city. I just, in the conversation you're having, I applaud the perspective putting out publicly from CARB on that the feds are lacking, that we need to push further on their initiative. And I appreciate the comments that this conversation is pressing further in changing this particular industry, which has higher concentrations of the pollution. I understand the supervisor, Mr. Alatorre's comments in the grander scheme of things, but to zero down in the front line as our regular community, as you as well, you understand the accumulation of all these environmental air issues that we're breathing in. We must keep pushing to try to minimize. We have to heat each industry, each source, to try to minimize, to overall minimize our effect, our health impact. I will encourage to keep CARB to keep pushing in their initiative, also in collaboration with the AQMD. As I know in this particular conversation in rail, specifically, we are moving forward in these memorandums of understanding, but we must have some sort of support in addressing or even mitigating or doing some change. I know it's difficult here in the community environmental justice. It's not lost on me or us. But we must push forward, as Mr. Yanis said, that the future. We must start pushing the change, and has to start sooner than later. So I appreciate this conversation. It was to the point and really seeing the big picture here. But I encourage all to keep pushing the change, because without that, then we will not be progressing, and harm will still keep continuing, as accumulation will keep going on and on and on, and affecting us all, not only our personal healths, but also, as we've in the title of this of meeting, in the environment. Thank you all for the time to speak. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Moses. And I see that Carrie Doy has her hand up, and Carrie's on our EJAG. And unfortunately, Carrie, we're not going to be able to let you speak because your location was not noticed. I'm sure you received the email from staff regarding if you wanted to participate remotely. So unfortunately, we cannot allow you to speak. Are there any other questions from committee members before we go to the next item? Seeing none? Okay, let's go to the, oh, go ahead. Who's that?
Hi.
Rafael, okay.
Yeah, sorry. I had a couple of questions in regards to the slides, and
that's what I get for asking for any more questions.
I know. I was staring at my, like, all my notes, and I just wanted to so a couple of items in regards to I think what we could do to show federal regulators. I was kind of jotting it down when you were looking at the enforcement essentials and whatnot, is maybe we could use like peaks, or the peak system, and place them strategically. Let's say, for instance, over public bridges where we have rail undercrossings, and actually measure the rail yards and the railroad emissions coming into the various rail yards, and the frequency, and especially in and around the EJ communities. And then we can take that data and then present that to federal regulators and say, hey, look, this is what's going on that we have to contend with here in the federally regulated purview. And this is the data. You guys don't see this data, but now we could take this data and say, okay, so let's multiply this to every rail yard that's all across the US. Just because yours don't, accumulate pollution like here in Southern California, because you have the benefit of air being blown away, it doesn't mean that the pollution still is not occurring. And so here's the data. Here's the empirical field data to say, this is what's going on. And we do have, here in the US, we do have some level of control in terms of what other internationally regulated, industries comply to, and I'll expound on that. So many of for instance, a lot of the large locomotives are made by US companies, right? Especially here in the US. We have GE that makes, large locomotive engines, and I'm sure there's other manufacturers and whatnot. But then look at the airline and airplane industry. Boeing makes, quite a number of, right now they have a record number of orders, and all of those planes are being made in the US, and those are going to be shipped out to various international destinations and countries. And so if we can go ahead and, decide, hey, we need cleaner burning engines and, better fuels, and we have the companies that, and then, you know, the other company would be our counterparts in France, Airbus. And I'm sure Airbus, who has a plant here, also would like to make sure that all of the customers that they're buying here in the US are in compliance, and other European compliance, you know, because everybody's looking at this. And so customers like in the UAE who are purchasing lots and lots of planes, India who's buying lots and lots of planes, China who's buying lots and lots of planes, all of this stuff, it just becomes, you know, if the federal government can pass regulation, then we're able to branch out internationally and say, hey, look, we're producing cleaner burning engines and whatnot. And so this is how everybody can now tally their little score on global warming and the reduction of you know, emissions and whatnot. But you know, at some point we have to get industry, especially with all the black carbon pollution and all that stuff, that you just see, you know, as you look at just various documentaries of, you know, these brave explorers going out in the cold and going out to the Arctic and bringing back lots of, you know, pictures and videos of all the deposits and little puddles. And in the middle of the little puddle is a big bunch of accumulated black carbon. And you see lots and lots of puddles that ultimately are just Swiss cheese. I mean, this is directly from the pollution that's US is generating, China's generating. I mean, and you know, African nations to a lesser extent, you know, South American. I mean, it's huge. The issue is huge, and it takes a multi-level and multiple front approach on the problem. And so we got to do our share. And that's, I appreciate that CARB is actually doing that, AQMD is doing that, and I hope for more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. It all goes back to the federal government. Let's go to the next item, item number 5. That will be by Monica Kim. Give an update on the EJ conference. Monica.
Thank you, Derek. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Kim. I'll be giving a brief verbal update on the 9th Annual Environmental Justice Conference. So the EJ conference will be held on Wednesday, September 13th, 2023 from 10 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. at the Riverside Convention Center. And this year's theme is Building a Clean Air Future Together. The conference will be in person and live streamed through the Whova app and website. It will include a plenary session and 2 breakout sessions. And our keynote speaker will be Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia, who represents the 36th California Assembly District. And our featured speaker is Dr. Jalone White Newsom, who is the Senior Director for Environmental Justice at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. We are expecting approximately 200 in-person attendees, as well as a large number of virtual attendees, including federal, state, and tribal government agencies, educational institutions, community-based organizations, community leaders, and community members. Breakfast and lunch will be provided, and the event is completely free to attend. Registration is now open through Whova and Eventbrite. Spanish interpretation will be available, and free parking will be provided for all guests. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Monica. Any questions from the members? I can't see any hands raised, so staff's gonna have to help me.
There are no questions, Derek.
No questions. Let's go to public comment. Is there any public comment? Any hands raised? Monica?
No public comment.
Thank you very much. We'll go next to the next item, number 6. That is member updates. Are there any member updates? None, Monica?
Nope. No
That's
member.
good. Thank you very much. We'll go to the next item, which would be item number 7, public comment. Is there public comment?
Derek, we have one public comment.
Thank you very much. Let's open that up. And who is that going to be?
Harvey Etter.
Harvey, go right ahead.
Hello, am I being heard?
Yes, sir. Go right ahead, Harvey.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Harvey Etter. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition and like-minded folk. Two things. One, an indirect source rule. This issue came before the board at the last meeting, and there was spirited discussion on it, maybe at committee meetings. But with the indirect source rule from the ports to the warehouses, the EJ groups each had made another additional day and made a special motion that they sent to the board saying, we support this. Okay. Now with this issue of MOU and this double talk that's going on, whether, you know, who's pushing what are the implications, who's going to sue and what the, you know, this and that. I think, you know, that this group should come out supporting strongly an indirect source rule and call out this lying that's going on, and let's move on. And the other group that's related to this as well. Now, also on the plans. Now, there's a scoping plan that's being done now, and as basis of that scoping plan, the 22 plan that goes out to 37 that this district submitted is part of that. Now, a big thing that we brought up and from the very first time that Dr. Scott Epstein presented this to the board, he said that they had these fires and stuff and that these are exceptional. Okay, we've seen this going on for 5-10 years in the state. It's not exceptional. It's the new normal. And for the environmentalists to stick their heads in the sand like ostriches and call it something else is garbage. It's worse than Trump. We know better. Okay. The fright of what's going on if the Republicans continue as a party, and if we end out with Trump or some variation of that, we got real problems in River City, and we got to deal with this. Okay, so I think we got to take action and be assertive as we were in the indirect source rule from the ports, and we got that task. And the thing is, now this is for railroads, okay, from the old Western movies, and I'm putting this into the record. I'm old. Maybe you don't remember the old Westerns on TV. But the railroads that come into a town, and they get a mile of land on each side of the track. They owned everything, okay? Now, 100 years later, we got redlining in the banks 50 years later. That's where that came from, okay? That's got to be challenged. That property has to be redistributed among the community and the workers in the community. When you got 2/3 of the U.S., according to Piketty, Economist France 14 and 20, that there's been no increase in income or equity for 2/3 of the country for 50 years, 40, 50 years. And that productivity has gone up 70, 80%.
Thank you, Harvey. There's no other public comment. Our next meeting is October the 27th. Is that correct, Monica?
That's correct.
Okay, and I adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to seeing you in October. Thank you.
Did you count, this is Dr. Beeson, did you count the number of people present? Do we have enough quorum to do the approval of the minutes? We never met a quorum. Okay.